Born on December 10, 1866, Karl Maria Wiligut was the product of a strongly militaristic Viennese family in what was then the still powerful Austro-Hungarian Empire. Despite his conservative and deeply traditionalist upbringing, Maria Wiligut remains to this day one of the most important and overlooked influences in the development of what today we would term as neo-paganism. His legacy, now largely tainted by his political association, nevertheless it is still entirely fair to state that the Germanic neo-paganism of today owes much of its lineage and revival to Karl Maria Wiligut and his mystical visions and interpretations. Even if these interpretations were inaccurate and fanciful, they still served as an enormous influence which remains with us to the present. By the time he was 17, Karl Maria Wiligut was conscripted into the army, eventually receiving his officer's commission in 1884. By the time the Great War of World War I arrived in 1914, he was still staunchly Roman Catholic and had risen to the rank of colonel, receiving awards for gallantry on both the Italian and Eastern fronts. Like so many veterans of the trenches, Maria Wiligut returned to his family in Salzburg a very different man indeed. With the Austro-Hungarian Empire removed from existence, and with this his personal and cultural identity, he found refuge in writing mystical poetry and then eventually within the lodges of several Masonic orders. This was the point when his interest in spiritual and occultic mysticism began to take hold of him completely. Eventually he became discontented by the ancient Egyptian and Judeo-Christian elements of Austrian Freemasonry, and it was with this that Maria Wiligut began to look deeply into his own racial spiritual identity. Considering himself to be something of an ancestral clairvoyant, derived from the male lineage of his family, he claimed to have unleashed a kind of spiritual genealogy within himself that stretched all the way back to the pre-Celtic and Teutonic tribal eras of ancient Europe. The timing was perfect. This was at the height of the Völkisch movements during the early years of the 20th century, and Karl Maria Wiligut had been drawn to the Ordo Novo Templi, who, despite their typically Latin name, considered Maria Wiligut and his gift for ancestral clairvoyance to be the ideal foundation upon which to draft a new paganized history of the Germanic peoples, particularly in regard to his reimagined spiritual and racial origins. These old new Germans combined theosophy with Ariosophy, and Maria Wiligut soon became one of the spiritual players within the movement, originally founded by Guido von List. Central to this idea was Carl Maria Wiligut 200,000-year epic history of the Germanic peoples, who were believed to be once a highly advanced, both culturally and technically, racial group which dominated Central and Northern Europe until the Middle Ages. The new mythology became known as Irmanism, derived from the worship of the Irminsul, a symbolic tree of the Saxon tribes, which was destroyed in the Middle Ages by Charlemagne's Christian army. Imerism sought to re-establish paganism as the central spiritual core of the German people. Christianity was to be seen as a spiritual infection from the Middle East, which had made the Germanic people weak and docile. This idea took root very strongly within certain segments of Germanic society, and would eventually become a central core to much of the spiritual trajectory of the Third Reich's later military ambitions. Irmanism, on the other hand, was to replace these spiritual and psychological deficiencies within Christianity, which was to be converted to the more Aryan ideals of honour and valour. Carl Maria Wiligut claimed that the Christian Bible was originally a Germanic saga, and Wotan, and not Jesus, was the central figure. Christians later reinvented the Christus, or the Christ, into the Jesus Christ of the New Testament. In this sense, the Christus or Christ was Wotan, and not the Hebrew from the Middle East. The Irmanists also claimed that the crucifixion scene, as told in the New Testament, it was in actuality Wotan or Odin suspended from the world or Yggdrasil, as mentioned in the Nordic and Germanic sagas. Not far from Bielsberg Castle is the remarkable rock formation of the Echsensteine, a place of spiritual pilgrimage and veneration since pagan Saxon times, and perhaps even beyond that. Carved upon the rock face is a frieze from the late Middle Ages depicting Christians hacking down the Immersol tree. Above this is a scene of the Christ crucifixion. Carl Maria Wiligut's interpretation of the crucifixion as being originally a European idea can be seen as outlined in this artwork, and for many it did indeed become compelling evidence for Maria Wiligut's followers. The Echsensteine frieze only copper fastened his view, and soon afterwards he began working as an editor for an anti-communist newspaper. On the individual level, Carl Maria Wiligut, like so many German and Austrian males of his generation, were profoundly affected in a deeply negative way by the Great War, and particularly what happened due to the shockwaves in the wake of the Versailles Treaty. Probably as a direct result of this, Maria Wiligut entered into an asylum in Salzburg in 1924. Much of this appears to have come about as a result of him becoming increasingly hostile to his wife, as she had not provided him with a son in order to validate his claim that the ancestral clairvoyancy would only be passed on through the male line of the family. Not having a son in his mind placed this legacy in terminal jeopardy. The one son his wife had given birth to had died in infancy, although it has yet to be fully established if this was indeed the reason for Carl Maria Wiligut being sectioned within a mental hospital, as his beliefs had already identified him as an extremist to the Austrian establishment. Therefore it was not inconceivable that any excuse at all may have been justified he continued to work on his ideas until his release in 1927. For the era, it has to be said that Carl Maria Willigut's views were only moderately radical, during a time when extremists on all ends of the political spectrum held centre stage. However, his mythology became central to a more politically orientated approach following his emigration to Munich. There, Maria Wiligut became a popular figure within the Völkisch movement. His work was featured in the magazine Hagel, a popular media arm of the Edda Society. Groups such as the Free Sons of the North and the Baltic Seas considered Maria Wiligut as a great mystic of the age. In 1933, SS leader Heinrich Himmler was introduced to the Austrian émigré by the name of Carl Maria Wiligut. Himmler was spellbound by his knowledge and enthusiasm for ancient Germanic mythology and legends, in particular the potential for these ideas to replace Christianity in Germany with an Aryan religion called Immerism. So impressed with Carl Maria Wiligut that Himmler immediately recruited him into the SS using the pseudonym of Karl Maria Weisdorf. He then appointed him head of the SS historical advisor with the Race and Settlement Office in Munich. Carl Maria Wiligut was to become one of the most influential figures in 20th century Germany, and his legacy concerning the popularity and re-emergence of neo-paganism in Europe today has all been forgotten as a result of the merging of spiritual and political ideas, and why the two should always be kept apart. By the time Carl Maria Wiligut had become a highly influential figure within the mysticism of the SS, he had become personal friends with Himmler. Much of the symbolism and the motifs of the SS were designed by Maria Wiligut. With the Irmis religion having found a strong following within the SS, the stage was now set for the creation of a Germanic neo-pagan spiritual centre, something of a Vatican or Mecca for Irmanism.